what's his name? Sarah Palin's running mate. Anyway, thank you. John McCain. For some reason, he's not as memorable. They have both admitted that the Olympics are a boon to business. They're a gift to developers. They're not really a gift to the community. Mitt Romney was involved in the Salt Lake City Games and admitted that this was basically a way to funnel public money into private hands. And that's exactly what's happening in case of Vancouver. We're putting $6 billion into the Olympics and Olympic development. And the profits, what there are to be had, are had by the IOC and the Olympic sponsors. The IOC is unaccountable to any government, completely untransparent and inaccessible through freedom of information requests, and pays taxes to no one. So to say it's an unaccountable body doesn't even scratch the surface. It's so unaccountable and yet thinks so much of itself, it's actually applied for honorary nation status at the UN. So it's very disturbing that this totally unaccountable corrupt organization would be treated the same as any other nation at the UN. So $6 billion, and in addition, a lot of money is hidden behind the books. The $6 billion is what journalists can track and prove, but the history of the Olympics shows that a lot of spending is behind the books and behind closed doors. They don't count it as Olympic spending, even though it is. So the bill is probably closer to about $10 billion, plus a lot of crony deals for developers and corporate sponsors. One of the biggest concerns for people that want to express themselves about these issues is the huge amount of policing, security, and surveillance that goes along with the games. The Olympic history of political suppression is incredibly long. It is reliable at every single games that there's increasingly militarized policing, increasingly stringent suppression of free speech. If you go back to the Mexican Games of 1968, where they slaughtered between 300 and 400 students and activists, this was done not just by Mexican Olympic security, but Olympic security visiting from other countries, including the U.S., because of the potential embarrassment of having massive protests during the Mexico City Games. So a slaughter of several hundred students before the games, barely noted when it came time for the 68 games, which of course was more noted for the Black Power salute, which they then tried to punish those athletes for. And people like to talk about political suppression around the games as if it's something that came from Beijing. But having studied the history, it's something, especially with modern games, that really goes everywhere the games do. Certainly in Beijing, we have the experience of the free speech zones, which is something they've talked about in Vancouver as well. But we all know that they weren't used. The reason they weren't used was because the vast majority of people that applied for the permits you needed to get into the free speech zones were sent to camps or sent to jail or disappeared or murdered. So the history of that isn't something Beijing came up with and justified on its own. It actually is something that goes everywhere the Olympics goes, a traditional crackdown on the visibility of public dissent that is sometimes very violent. When you look at what's happening in 2010, they have a $1 billion security budget. And very interesting, because originally they said, we'll only need $175 million to secure the games. And if you look at the history of other games, you'll see that that was definitely downplayed. They downplayed that in order to get the support of the public during the bid phase. But now they admit they need about $1 billion. And what do they need that $1 billion for? That's something interesting that has come out. That's one interesting thing that has come out. Instead of the CIA in Canada, we have CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, and they do what we call threat assessments. And to show you the type of wisdom these guys have, right prior to 9/11, the number one domestic threat to security that they were concerned about were anti-globalization activists. Then all of a sudden, 9/11 comes, they have to do a little bit of rewriting of history, but then when they were looking towards the games, they admitted that their major concern was Olympic protesters. Terrorism, street crime, much farther down the list. The primary threat in their own assessment, anti-globalization, anti-Olympic, environmental, and indigenous protesters. Traditionally, those have been the objects of concern of the security services in Canada, and their problem for them is that the Olympics unites all of them. Anti-poverty activists, migrant and immigrant community activists, all of them united together around the Olympics, does pose a big threat. The threat it poses is of political exposure, not necessarily of an actual security risk to the health of anybody involved in the games. But that's certainly how they're terming it. They're using this $1 billion not just to surveil and intimidate, but to acquire military-style policing tools that they've never had before. We acquired recently one of the LRADs, the sound cannons used at the G20, and as well regular increases in the amount of tear gas. They rented out entire spaces for lockers that they could fill with rubber bullets and guns and tear gas canisters and pepper spray and armored personnel carriers. And I know we remember how fun it is to be tear gassed and on the ground of the streets of Seattle and nearly get run over by an armored personnel carrier. So these things certainly are to be used against peaceful protesters because there is no security threat. Exactly. There's been a lot of impact in Bellingham, as well as a bit of a poverty cleanup in Bellingham for people coming through. So all of this weaponry, they're justifying it by talking about the violent protest plans that people have. They like to say there's an international criminal to protest the games. And we've been involved in organizing around the Olympics for years. I would love to know the details of this international criminal conspiracy, because as far as I know, it substantiates to a few cross-border meetings like this and some international solidarity letters between cities like Chicago and Rio and London that are hosting the games in the future. And they like to talk about the violent imagery. A police officer recently went to city council and said, you know, I went on the internet for 15 minutes and I found violent imagery, people making cartoons of Olympic mascots with balaclavas and Molotov cocktails. That shows that they have violent plans to hurt individuals. And when I got a chance to respond, I said, that's very interesting, because I'll have to remind you, those are cartoons, and if I spent 5 minutes online, I could find actual videotape of both the Vancouver Police Department and the Mounties murdering people in Vancouver, murdering immigrants at the airport, murdering people on the streets of Vancouver. So if you want to think about where the violence is going to come from, it's certainly not from demonstrators. Whether you're direct action, civil disobedience, or a traditional protester, nobody's talking about violence towards human beings except the police. So the legacy that they've talked about, Jacques Rogue, the head of the IOC, was in Canada a while ago, spoke of the great legacy that the security infrastructure leaves for a city. And a lot of what they're talking about are closed-circuit television monitorings, the increased budget for the police, and these kind of militarized weapons. If you look at places like Sydney and Athens, the imposition that we're going to have of about 1,000 additional public video monitors are often permanent. That's the legacy of Olympic security in most host cities. And additionally, the impact on civil liberties. The host city agreement that you sign with the Olympics say that you will not allow any visible advertising or propaganda to be seen from any Olympic venue or in the airspace. So some of these Olympic venues are actually on public space. They're in public parks, public libraries, public streets. So they brought in bylaws in Vancouver that outlaw political signs, political leaflets, political communications, street theater, busking, soapboxing, megaphones, or any behavior that can be determined to be a nuisance to someone's enjoyment of the games. So they brought in these massive bylaws restricting our constitutional expression on huge amounts of public space, including almost every major road in Vancouver is declared an Olympic traffic corridor, which means no political signs on those streets, no leaflets, no political activity. Wow. It's shocking, but that's not unusual. That's something they've done at other games, and that's something they're bringing in for London as well. They went so far as to bring in a bylaw that would allow them to enter private property and remove Olympic signs. So if you want to put up a sign in your house, your office, or your car, technically they would be able to let the police go into your house on limited notice and remove that sign. If you have what they call